So now to continue with the review for test 3, the next thing we talked about was something called the range rule of thumb, okay? And so we learned that even though the standard deviation and range aren't directly related, that you can estimate the standard deviation by taking the range divided by 4 if you don't have the complete amount of information. So you can get kind of a feel for the standard deviation. And remember that if there are very extreme values, this isn't going to be quite as accurate. You can also get a feel for the range from the standard deviation, or a value in the sense that a low value and a high value are approximately, and remember, this is low usual values, okay? So usual values in your data set are going to be within 2 standard deviations of the mean. So if you take the mean and subtract 2 standard deviations and add 2 standard deviations, you can actually subtract these to get high minus low to get an estimate of the range. But also you can create an interval, and anything in this interval would be considered usual, and anything smaller than the lowest value or higher than the highest value would be considered an unusual value, okay? So we did talk about that range rule of thumb that you should pretty much know. I did, if you look at the formulas, I do kind of give you a feel for what those values are. I don't think you can see all of them right here, okay? So you just have to remember what they are, but there they are in the formulas that you'll be given. Okay, then we also have the measures of relative standing, which are also called measures of location, okay, or measures of position. So you'll see them described in many different ways, okay? Location and position. Now, a couple things. Again, remember when you're finding quartiles or percentiles, it's very often people forget to order their data. You do need an ordered array. And you also are going to need to know how to interpret these values, what they mean, okay? So we talked about percentiles and quartiles. Quartiles, remember, you just find quartiles are percentiles that divide the data into quarters. But for the quartiles, we talked about how to find those. The second quartile is the median, and the first quartile is the median of the lower half of your data, and the third quartile is the median of the upper half of your data. Now, to find particular percentiles, so if you want to know what the percentile of a particular data value is, let me write that. This you're going to have to just know how to do. You won't be given the formulas, but the percentile of a data value, what you do is you count the number of values less than that number, okay, in the data set, in the ordered array. Let me write X, okay? So let's call this a data value X, divided by the total number of values, or N, the total number of values in your data set, and then you'll multiply that by 100, okay? And if you just want to know what a percentile is, remember, to find the percentile, we just look for the location, okay? So the location, what you're going to do is you're going to take the percentile in percentage form, right? And multiply by your sample size, okay? To find the percentile value, okay? So what does a percentile tell us? Well, if you're, for example, looking for the 10th percentile, what that means is that 10% of the data values fall below that number. Quartiles are just percentiles. So when I say, oh, interpret the third quartile, remember the third quartile is just the 75th percentile, right? And so you would interpret it like a percentile. So if you scored, for example, let's say you took a test and you scored you were the third quartile, that means that 75% of the people who took the exam with you scored below you. There are other interpretations. Again, if you recall, there are many different methods of finding percentiles and quartiles, and we're doing a very simple way, but they essentially get you to the same place. So again, this isn't the only formula. There are more exact ways of doing this, but this kind of gives you a feel for that. Another measure of location that we talked about is a z-score, what we call a standardized score. And what it does is it tells us, so if you take one value out of the data set, this is true for all measures of relative standing, you want to know how that value compares to all the other values in the data set. And one way to do that is to standardize the scores, which really helps when you have two or more data sets that are on different scales. It allows you to compare them. It allows you to look at their performance, okay? Allows you to look at their performance. So what you do is you take that particular value, you subtract off the mean for the data set and divide by the standard deviation. So you're rescaling your data so you can talk about how many standard deviations a value is above or below the mean. So when the value is positive, you're that many standard deviations above the mean. When the value is negative, you're that many standard deviations below the mean. The z-score also helps you with our definition of outliers. Okay, so we're going to talk about an outlier being anything that is more than 3 standard deviations from the mean. In other words, outside of this interval, which is x bar minus 3 standard deviations and x bar plus 3 standard deviations. So again, we've done this kind of twice. Up at the top here, we talked about a value being usual if it's within 2 standard deviations of the mean and unusual if it's outside of that. But again, outliers are going to come from being more than 3 standard deviations of the mean. So again, when you calculate a z-score, if you get a z-score of 2 or more in absolute value, 2 or more, that's going to be considered an unusual value. If you get a z-score of 3 or more, then you're going to have a value that's considered an outlier, okay? So again, don't forget that you need to know how to interpret these values. I don't know if you can see that. Interpret the values like we talked about in class. So this is the material that's going to be on the third exam. So again, you should probably go back through your notes and work as many problems as possible. So hopefully you've done the problems not only on the online homework, but more importantly, the one that are given with the notes that are for you to do. Here are the formulas. Again, this is what it'll look like, but remember you can, I'm going to kind of fill these in. This is your coefficient of variation, your z-score, and this is the variance. Remember, the standard deviation will be the square root. This was kind of the long formula, and this was the shortcut formula that I had given you. And then here's what you need for that range rule of thumb. Okay, so this is the review for test number 3. This is the material that will be covered.